Welcome to the African American Folklore series, a living library where I discuss the known and unknown elements of the indigenous folkloric traditions of Black Americans and their connection to our society today. If this is your first time watching, I'm Jonathan, a short story author, classical singer, and performer who was fascinated by folklore and the occult. This is episode 2, part 1, which will cover the etymology of fairies and cultural distinctions around fairies. In part 2, we will dive more deeply into the specific fairies of African American lore. So, let's get started. Die Feen, Aos Si, Fata, Fada, los Feericos, la Fe, Mmoatia, Nunnehi, Yumboes, Abatwa, Aziza, Fairies. These spirits are known, beloved, honored, and sometimes feared in many cultural and ritual traditions across the world. And just to be clear, I am using the word fairy here as an umbrella term for various immortal beings, ranging from forest-dwelling little people to tall supernatural beings that inhabit or live amid various natural forces, such as lakes, streams, mountains, caves, falls, woodlands, jungles, deserts, and volcanoes. Recordings and cultural practices surrounding fairies are everywhere in the world in some form, and the most defining feature of them that I have found is that they are capricious, meaning you never know what you're going to get when a fairy is involved. So, what is a fairy? And you're also probably wondering, how have African American communities conceived of fairies? Don't worry, I've got you covered. To get started, we'll look at some texts. In a study of fairy tales by Laura Creedy, published in 1916, the text describes the work of Thomas Cately, a folklorist writer from Ireland who published fairy mythology in 1828. In his findings, the word's origin derives from the Latin fatum, which means to enchant, and it is connected to various root words which give us terms such as the Italian fata, or the French fée or féerie for illusion. Thus, if you've already picked up on it, is how we got the word fate. In the old French Romance language, the word fée meant a woman skilled in magic and enchantments, an herbalist who worked with her hands and had knowledge of stones, charms, and knew how to bend energy from natural forces to prolong her life. Fairy, on the other hand, meant several different things. It referred to the fairy country. It referred to a description of any kind of enchantment. It referred to fairy inhabitants of the country that produced the enchantment. And it referred to someone who was native to the land of the fairies. Later on, however, thanks to Shakespeare, the word fairy became synonymous and became merged with sprites and other little beings of strange color who were very wild and outlandish and capricious and made human lives a living hell. And so because of that era's entire corpus of works around fairies, such as, the Fairy Queen, and, A Midsummer's Night Dream, the notion of fairies as little beings, as well as larger beings as well, because Oberon and Titania, I don't really believe were described as being small in stature. Or rather, even beings that could even change their size. Like, size was irrelevant. Size was only of concern to human beings. They could become small and fly on the backs of sparrows, or they could become the size of atomies, the spirits of light that would float in the air and were considered to be connected to the source of all creation. In this particular way, that is when fairies became synonymous with little beings that floated through the light. And this is not to say that the description of fairies as little beings is something that Shakespeare invented. It's just that he popularized the idea, because sightings and notions of there being little beings of light predate Shakespeare by millennia. So, he didn't invent the actual idea. He just popularized it in his works. And because the works of the Bard are considered, the cornerstone of much of Western literature, we tend to not just refer to him, but refer to him and everyone else that his work influenced later on in terms of fairy literature and what fairies meant to the populace. But for African Americans, this was a very different process. And then later on through this, fairies became connected to other supernatural beings such as elves, dryads, naiads, and nymphs, which also predate the notion of the modern fairy by millennia. So, what about other supernatural beings, small in stature or otherwise, that exist in non-European cultures? And this is where we're going to dive into the meanings and the associations of fairy lore as it relates to African American people and its connection to the diaspora and its connection, of course, obviously, to the continent from which it came. So, stay tuned. So, let's talk about fairies. More specifically, African American fairies. But I will start this off by saying that African American fairy lore is rare. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's just been much more difficult to find because the common stereotype of what a fairy is to a modern day ordinary person doesn't exactly match up with the cultural experiences of a Black person who is connected with the cultural beliefs surrounding nature spirits, thus fairies. And these cultural beliefs define various nature spirits by different names that are distinct from the European ones more familiar to the Western eye, such as the infamous She. And this distinction highlights the reality that not every culture categorizes things under the same, umbrella of fairy, or you can't impose. It's very difficult to, not impose, but it's very difficult to try and explain or introduce distinct concepts from different cultures using the same language. So things will get lost in translation along the way. And I don't think this is a detractor from experiencing different cultures and seeing the commonalities between different cultures, but I think that it becomes a problem when people try to blanketly apply everything in every way and try to put everything into these rigid barriers that don't always line up with what has been established by people's different cultural modes of thinking. And African American culture is not an exception to this. We are an English-speaking culture, primarily, who are descended from people who originally did not speak English hundreds of years ago when they were brought to this country in slave ships. And as a result of that, our culture, our language, our foodways, our music, our dance, our art, our philosophies, even, all of that reflects this kind of connection, this broken, quote-unquote, broken connection. I don't really think it's broken. I think that it's, what's the word I want to use? I would say that it has changed. It has changed because the Africa of 400 years ago is not the Africa of now. You understand what I'm saying? But anyway, yes, so back to fairies. So things will get lost in translation along the way. It reminds me of when British missionaries were going into the Congo and creating translation guides in order to spread the Bible more effectively. And they had identified the powerful Simbi water spirits as fairies. Now, Simbi water spirits are a very important foundational element in African American hoodoo, but we'll get into that later. But this is what I'm talking about in terms of how are we defining fairy in one culture versus another, and if those two things match up. And I think that people need to start looking at not the words themselves, but the lore and the myths and the superstitions and beliefs surrounding those various beings, which will make them, it'll probably make it easier for them to become more relational at the end of the day. But however, the reason African American fairies have been hard to find is, I think, for two reasons. One is because certain academics and folklorists have been looking in all the wrong places, or they haven't been looking at all because they think there's nothing there to find. They've been looking for little winged people that are basically Afrocentric versions of early modern era European fairies. They're looking for mean-spirited, tricky, capricious beings with green skin that just look black instead of white. And there are mean-spirited, tricky, capricious beings across the diaspora, across the continent, who make human lives a living hell in the way that many fairies in European lore make human lives a living hell, depending on who you ask. But in this particular video, I'm focusing on the beneficence of fairies, or more correctly, nature spirits. Secondly, African American culture during the plantation era was largely oral, and many stories about fairies have unfortunately been lost to public knowledge as older generations have passed away and or are only known in detail by very closed, specific lineages of spiritual practitioners in the Black community. Whereas other beings and concepts, such as beast fables, devils, haints, graveyard spirits, talking skulls, boohags and flesh-eating witches, sorcerers, mystical hoes, flying Africans, and tall-tale heroes, such as Annie Christmas and John Henry, are much more readily available to find. So, if you go with the definition of fairy as a powerful, primordial nature spirit, regardless of size, then fairies are everywhere in African American lore. They just might not be called fairies outright. For Black people, our plantation spirituality was an inherently animist one, a world where various natural forces in everything could be learned from, awakened, and even used in spellcraft to empower us. And sometimes these various natural forces or spirits may present themselves to the practitioner as tall, commanding beings. Other times they may be smaller in stature, recognizable to the Western eye as what a fairy should look like. When they're the former, one can still call them fairies. And when they're the latter, one can still call them fairies. And in this context of fairies being little beings of spiritual light that interact with the natural world, some Black storytellers of the South have called them the little ones a-glowing. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Coming up next in a few days will be part 2 to this video on finding Black fairies in the US South. So, if you'd like to see more of this series, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. And as always, my beloveds, stay magical.